Well, hello there, and thank you for tuning in to my reading. I'm Cory Doctorow, and I'm going to read to you some of the first chapter of Attack Surface. This is the third Little Brother book. It's just come out in October 2020 as I read this to you. It's a month when everything is on fire. Greetings to those of you in the future. I hope it turns out better than it's trending now. uh, ugh. All right, then. Here's a little of chapter 1 of Attack Surface. That was why I love technology. If you use it right, it gives you power and takes away other people's privacy. I was on my 16th straight hour at the main telecoms data center for Blitzed, the capital of Slovakia. Those are both aliases, of course. Unlike certain persons I could name, I keep my secrets. 16 hours for what my boss had assured the client, the Slovakian Interior Ministry, would be a 3-hour job. You don't get as high as she did in the Stasi without being able to. Sorry. You don't get as high as she did in the Stasi without knowing how to be a tactical asshole when the situation demands it. I just wish she'd let me recce the data centers before she hands down the work estimates. The thing is, the communications infrastructure of Slovakia was built long before the Berlin Wall fell, and it consisted of copper wires wrapped in newspaper and dipped in gutta percha. After the wall came down, responsibility for telecoms had been transferred into the loving hands of Anton Chaki, who had once been a top spook in Soviet Slovakia. There are a lot of decades in which it would suck to have your telecoms run by an incompetent, greedy technocrat. Beg your pardon, an incompetent, greedy kleptocrat. But the 1990s represented a particularly poorly chosen decade to have sat out the normal cycle of telecoms upgrades. Because internet. After Takachi was purged, imprisoned in 2005, hospitalized with mental illness in 2006, dead in 2007, the Slovakian Ministry of Communications cycled through a succession of contract operators: Swisscom, T-Mobile, Vodafone, Orange, God help us all, each of which billed the country for some of the jankiest telecoms gear you've ever seen, the thrice-brewed teabags of the telecommunications world, stuff that had been in war zones, leaving each layer of gear half configured, half secured, and half documented. The internet in Slovakia sucked monkey shit. Anyway, my boss, Ilza, she-wolf of the SS, promised the Interior Ministry that I would only need 3 hours, and the Interior Ministry had called up the Telecoms Ministry and given them orders to be nice to the Amerikansky lady who was coming over to do top-secret work for them, and give her everything she needed. I can tell they laid it on thick, because when I first arrived at the country's main data center, a big old brutalist pile that I had to stop and take a picture of for my collection of Soviet brutalist buildings that they used to shoot you for taking pictures of, hashtags are for losers who voluntarily submit to 280-character straitjackets and a sentence can to a proposition end with, the guy on the desk sent me straight to the director of telecom security. His name was Litvinchuk, and he was tightly wound. You could tell because he had his own force of telecoms cops, dressed like RoboCop, standing guard outside his door with guns longer than their legs, reeking of garlic sausage and the sweat of 1,000 layers of Kevlar. Litvinchuk welcomed me cordially, gave me a long-ass speech about how excited he was to have fresh foreign contractors in his data center again, and especially ones from a company as expensive as Zoth Intelligence. Wait, that's not the right word, he said, in a broad Yakov Smirnov accent. He had a master's from the London School of Economics, and I'd watched him do a TEDx talk where he sounded like a BBC World Service newsreader. Exclusive? Illustrious? He looked to me, specifically to my tits, which was where every Slovakian official I'd met addressed his remarks. I did not cross my arms. Infamous, I said. He smirked. I'm sure. Ms. Maximov. He pronounced the W as a V, as they always did as soon as I got east of France. We are all very excited to have you at our premises. However, I'm sure that you will understand that we must be careful to keep records of which contractors work on our sensitive systems. He slid a paper-clipped form across the desk to me. I counted to 7, more efficient and just as effective as 10, and picked it up. 9 pages, smudgily photocopied, full of questions like, list all NGOs and charitable organizations to which you have contributed directly or indirectly. No, I said. He gave me his best fish face, which I'm sure was super effective against the farm boys cosplaying Judge Dredd in the hallway, but I had been glared at by Ilza, she-wolf of the etc., and had been inured to even the hairiest of eyeballs. I must insist, he said. I don't fill in this kind of form, I said. Company policy. Zoth has negotiated blanket permission to access your premises from the Interior Ministry for all its personnel. This was true. I hated paperwork, and this kind of paperwork the most, the kind that asked you questions you could never fully or honestly answer, so there would always be an official crime to pin on you if you stepped on the wrong toes. Lucky for me, Zoth had a no exceptions policy that techs were not allowed to fill in any official documentation at client sites. I'd take notes on my own work, but they'd go up the chain to my boss, Ilza, she-wolf, etc., who'd sanitize them and pass them back to the Interior Ministry for their own logs, omitting key details, so that they would be able to bill them for any future maintenance. I did my best to look bored. Not hard. I was so bored my eyeballs ached, and stared at this post-Soviet phone commissar. I will fill it in for you, he said. I shrugged. He worked quickly, pen dancing over the paper. Not his first paper pushing rodeo. He passed it back to me. Sign, he smiled. It wasn't a nice smile. I looked down. It was all in Cyrillic. Nope, I said. He swished off the smile. Madam, he made it sound like Missy. I could tell that we weren't going to get along. You will not get into my data center until we have gathered basic information. That is our protocol. He stared at me, fish face plus, clearly waiting for me to lose my cool. Long before Ilza began her regime of hardcore stoicism training, I had mastered situations like this. You don't get far in the DHS if you don't know how to bureaucracy. I turned my boredom up by a notch. I tried to project the sense that I had more time to burn than he did. He held out his hand. I'd assumed that he'd be a short-fingered vulgarian, but he had pianist's fingers and a hell of a manicure, the kind of thing that made me feel self-conscious about my lack of girly cred. ID. Zoth gives us fancy ID cards to wear on client sites, with RFIDs and sapphire-coated smart chips and holograms, props for impressing rubes. I could knock one up in an afternoon. I unclipped mine from my lanyard and handed it over. His pen danced again at the bottom of the form, and he turned the paper to show me. He'd added, signed per Masha Maximo, to the signature line. Good for you, Boris. You made a funny. What an asshole. We done? He carefully made a Xerox on a desktop printer scanner copier, one that I knew 5 different exploits for, and could use to take over his whole network if I wanted to, and handed it to me. For your records. I folded it into quarters and stuck it in my back pocket. Which way? He said something in Ruski, and one of the stormtroopers struggled in under the weight of his body armor and escorted me to the data center. I took one look at the racks and racks of hardware, zipped up my fleece against the icy wind of the chillers, and got to work. It was going to be a long 3 hours. By the time I finally finished, I was freezing and swearing. My hoodie was totally inadequate, and I suspected that my long-fingered vulgarian had ordered one of his armored Borises to turn the thermostat down to subarctic. But it was done, and the test cases ran, and so I got up off the folding chair I'd been hauling around the data center's corridors as I moved from one rack to another, tracing wires, untangling the hairball of grifty IT contractor shortcuts and fat fingering. Surveying my work, I had a deep feeling of, well, to be honest, a deep feeling of pointlessness. I had labored for 16 hours, 15 if you subtract meals and pee breaks, getting the Zoth SecTech network appliance installed, and all I had to show for my trouble was an inconspicuous black 1-unit high server box mounted on the bottom shelf of the furthest rack. This was Zoth policy. Put our gear in the most out-of-the-way place, just in case barbarian hordes toppled our dictator clients and stormed the gates, looking for mediagenic evidence of collaboration with evil surveillance contractors. That would be me. But now I got to celebrate. I looked over my shoulder and made sure I was alone. The robo-cops made a point of standing behind me, watching my ass as I dragged my chair around. Bent down and touched my toes, feeling the awesome stretch in my hamstrings and in the unkinking of my neck and shoulders as my hair brushed the ground. Then I stood, crack my knuckles, plug my laptop into my phone, and tunnel to a network box I'd left in my hotel room that morning, making sure that it was all charged up and successfully connected to the hotel's Wi-Fi, which, see above, sucked monkey shit. I fired up a virtual machine on my laptop, choosing a container with a fully patched version of the latest freebie version of Windows, and used its browser to connect to Facebook. The Slovakian uprising hadn't yet figured out that the only real use for Facebook in a revolution was to teach people how to use something more secure than Facebook. All their communications were in a couple of groups they accessed over Tor's hidden server, good old https://facebook.core.wwi.onion, which was pretty good operational security, if I did say so myself. The problem was that they were way, way outgunned. As of now, they were facing the best that Zoth had to offer, or at least the best Zoth had to offer in its middle-upper pricing tier. Things were about to get very, very bad for the plucky demonstrators of Slovakia. The virtual Windows box in my virtual machine connected through the hotel's network to Tor, the Onion router, a system that bounced network connections all over the world, separately encrypting each hop, making it much harder to trace, intercept, or modify the user's packets, and to Facebook's hidden service, a darknet site based in a much nicer data center than this one, in an out-of-the-way corner of Oregon with remarkably low year-round temperatures. Ambient chilling is the #1 money saver when it comes to running a building full of superheated computers. I alt-tabbed into my monitor for the SecTech box beside me, using an untunneled interface on my phone's native network connection. The SecTech box could handle 10 million simultaneous connections, combing through all their packet streams using machine learning models originally developed to recognize cancer cells on a microscopic slide. Fun fact! Sure enough, it registered the existence of a stock Windows laptop in the Sofitel Blitzed, communicating over Tor. It profiled the machine by fingerprinting its packets, did a quick lookup in Zoth's customer-facing API to find a viable exploit for that configuration, and injected a redirect to the virtual machine on my laptop. I pinned the monitor window to the top of my desktop and flipped back to the VM, watching as the browser's location bar flickered to an innocuous-seeming error message, and by flipping to a diagnostic view of the VM, I could see the payload strike home. It used a 0-day for Tor browser, always based on a slightly out-of-date version of Firefox and thus conveniently vulnerable to yesterday's exploits, to bust out of the browser's sandbox and into the OS. Then it deployed a higher value exploit, one that attacked Windows, and inserted some persistent code that could bypass the bootloader's integrity check, hooking into a module that loaded later in the process. In less than 5 seconds, it was done. The virtual machine was fully compromised, and it was already trying to hook into my webcam and mic, scouring my hard drive for interesting files, snaffling up saved password files from my browser, and loading its keylogger. Since all of that was happening in a virtual machine, not an actual computer, just a piece of software pretending to be a computer, none of that stuff really happened, thankfully. Now it was time to really test it. SecTech had a mode where it can scour all of the traffic in and out of the network for specific email addresses and usernames to locate specific people. I gave it Litvinchuk's email address and waited for his computer to make itself known. Took less than a minute. He was polling the ministry's mail server every 60 seconds. 2 minutes later, I controlled his computer and I was cataloging his porn habits and downloading his search history. I have a useful script for this. It locates anything on my target's computers that makes mention of me, because I am a nosy bitch, and they should know better, really. Litvinchuk was into some predictably gross pornography. Why was it always being peed on? And had Googled the shit out of me, and also had a covert agent who'd searched my room. They put a location tagger on my phone using a crufty network appliance that I'd already discovered during my epic debugging session in the data center. I could have fed that logger false data, but I turned it off because fuck him sideways. I downloaded half a gig of videos of Litvinchuk in full-bore German heavy latex, gleaming with piss, then stood, stretched again, and shut my lid. I'd started my adventure at 4 p.m. the day before. Now it was 8 a.m., and that meant that the demonstrations in the main square would be down to skeleton crews. Anyone interesting only came out after supper time and worked the barricades in the dark, when the bad stuff always kicked off. That's when the provocateurs and neo-fascists came out. Often the same people, and the hardcore protesters had to work extra hard. I called the Sofitel on the way back and ordered room service. All they had was breakfast, and I wanted dinner, so I ordered triple, and gave up on explaining that I only needed one set of cutlery. I arrived at the room's door at the same time as the confused waiter. I waved at him and carted the door open, then followed him and his cart in. He was one of those older guys you saw around the hotel, someone who once had a job in a Soviet brute force heavy industry, but ended up pushing room service trolleys when it all went to China. Those guys never spoke English, not like their strapping sons, who spoke Gamer International, the language of Let's Play videos and image boards. Dobre, I said, pожалуйста, and took the folio from him and added a €10 tip. Everything in the Sofitel was denominated in euros, ever since the local currency had collapsed, and I hadn't even bothered to change any cash on this trip. But I had bought a 10 billion dinar note from an enterprising street seller who'd been targeting the tourist trade. I liked the engraving of the opera house on the back, but the Boris on the front was a unibrowed, thick-fingered Vulgarian straight out of Central Casting. I kept forgetting to Google him, but I was pretty sure he was being celebrated for something suitably terrible, purging Armenians or collaborating with Stalin. My alarm went off 4 hours later. I found my bathing suit and underwater MP3 player in the hotel robe, made sure all my devices were powered down and with their USB ports covered, and headed for the pool. Swimming, even with loud tunes, always churns my subconscious, boredom forcing it to look inward at its neglected corners. So somewhere around the 50th lap, it was a small pool, I remembered what was happening that day. I did the time zone calculation in my head and realized that there was still time to do something about it. Fuckity shit buckets. I hauled myself out of the pool and toward a towel. I perched dripping on the room's desk chair and powered up my phone for a quick peek at the pictures of the screw heads on my laptop. I had covered all the screws with glitter nail polish and shot clear pics of each one, with a little label beside it, so I could verify whether someone had unscrewed my laptop lid and done something sneaky, like inserting a hardware keylogger or, some Semtex and packing nails. I used an open-source astronomy package designed to match pictures with known constellations to verify 2 of the 7 screws. The glitter patterns had become old friends by this point, since I checked them every time I'd been out of sight of my computer before powering it up again. I booted it, pulled the towel over my head to defeat hidden cameras, and keyed in my passphrase while going, medium loud, just to defeat anyone trying to guess my passphrase from the sound of my fingers on the keys. Zoth had an air gap room for really sensitive stuff, wall shielded with a Faraday cage, full of computers that undercover Zoth techs had bought by walking into consumer electronics stores and buying computers off the shelf without ever letting them out of their sight. After being flashed with a Zoth version of Tails, a paranoid Linux distro, and having their Wi-Fi cards and Bluetooth radios ripped out with pliers, their USB ports were covered with 3D printed snaps that couldn't be removed without shattering them. You brought your encrypted data in on a thumb drive, requisitioned a machine, broke the seal, plugged in your USB stick, and read the data, then handed the machine back to a tech to be flashed and resealed. Compared to that shit, I wasn't all that paranoid. Litvinchuk had been a busy Boris. My computer had downloaded and sorted his own wiretap orders as he took SecTech out for a spin. I looked through the list and yep, I already knew a lot of those names. They were the people I was planning to meet for drinks in a few hours. I made a few quick revisions to my crypto party slides. It was getting to be time for lunch-ish or dinner-esque, whatever you call a 3 p.m. meal. I was about to phone down for room service when my phone alarmed me, which isn't something it does often because I've turned off every notifier. When that chirp goes off, it is a pure sphincter tightener. Weddus of Marcus Yallo and Ange Carvelli, and a shortened URL. Because live streaming. Because Marcus. Because exhibitionist attention whore. Because shithead. God, he drove me crazy. I fired up the live stream. They'd made everyone they love fly to Boston for the wedding because of the girls' grad school schedule, and they'd filled the hall with robots they borrowed from the MIT Media Lab to give it some nerd cred. Of course, she didn't wear white. Her dress was ribbed with EL wire that pulsed in time with the music, and Marcus's suit, Beatles black with a narrow tie and drainpipe pants that made his legs look even scrawnier than usual, was also wired up, but it only pulsed when they touched, moving bands of light across its surface from the point of contact. Okay, that was pretty cool. The officiant was a prominent Cambridge hacker, one of the ones they'd hauled in when they were after poor Chelsea Manning. She'd been a kid then, but now she looked older, her wife holding their kids on her lap off to one side. She wore a colander on her head because she was an ordained minister of the Church of the Flying Spaghetti Monster, which was frankly a bit much. Marcus and his girlie exchanged vows. Marcus promised to make her coffee, rub her feet, review her code, and say sorry and mean it. She promised to back down when she was wrong, forgive him when he apologized, and love him, quote, until the wheels came off. Double. They kissed and received their applause. I gave it 3 minutes, making sure that the ceremony was well and truly done and the reception about to start. I'm not a monster. Here's the thing about Cambridge. They have drone delivery there. For a little extra, you can time the delivery to the minute. I checked the time in the corner of the screen. There was a big window right behind the officiant with a view of the Charles River and the snow and the tracks of the students' boots. I checked the time again. The drone came right up to the window and rapped on it politely. It had 4 big rotors and a sensor package that fed me all kinds of telemetry on the activity in the room, from Bluetooth device IDs to LiDAR outlines of all the humans in the space. The wedding livestream showed it tapping on the window from the bride and groom's POV. The stream ran off a dozen cameras and was smart enough to switch between them, based on which one was capturing the most attention. The stream from the drone showed me the opposite view. Marcus and his girl and all their nice nerdly friends and family gaping at the fisheye camera. Marcus broke the tableau by opening the window, and the drone daintily coasted into the room and deployed its box into his hands. He pulled the rip strip on the plasticky wrapping and revealed the gift wrap box within. She took the card out of the envelope and read it. I admit it gave me a shiver to hear her say my name. When Marcus heard it, his face did a funny. That gave me a shiver too, a different kind. He and I have a complicated history. I rubbed my fingers, the ones he'd broken, when I was only 16. He did it in order to steal his phone because I had a video that exonerated him of being a terrorist. Complicated. Those fingers hurt whenever I thought of him. He looked at the drone sensor package. Thank you, Masha, he said, wherever you are. The usual for this was to be a recording that you could watch later, but if you were a creepy stalker chick, you could watch it in real time. I emojied the drone and it bobbled a curtsy and gave me 5 seconds to commit another $50 to hold on to it for 5 more minutes, because it had other packages to deliver. I released it, and its feed died. On the live stream, I watched them unwrap my gift. I'd almost sent them a bag of Kopi Luwak, which is a kind of coffee bean that's fed raw to a civet cat, then harvested from its poop and roasted. But I'd read an animal welfare site about the treatment of civet cats, so I'd given them a Raspberry Altair 8080. That is, a 1974 personal computer that you control with a row of faceplate switches and read using peanut bulb blinking lights, which had been painstakingly restored with a Raspberry Pi open source CPU inside it, giving it approximately 8 bazillion times the computing power of the interior. Giving it approximately 8 bazillion times the computing power. Most of the interior was left empty by the refit, and the craftswoman who sold it to me had filled the empty space with a bunch of carved wooden automata that cranked a set of irregular gears around in whirling circles while the computer was operating, which you could see if you swapped in the optional transparent case. Marcus knew exactly what it was, because I'd found it through his Twitter feed, and exactly how much it cost, because he'd moaned about never being able to afford it, not in a million years, and he had a look of profoundly satisfying shock on his face. He told his girlie all about it in that spittle-flecked, hyperactive mode he slipped into when he was really, really excited. The expression that crossed her face was even more satisfying, a mix of jealousy and appreciation that I reveled in like the petty, terrible person that I am. I felt like the fairy who curses Sleeping Beauty, out of spite when she thinks that she hasn't been invited to her christening. Except that this was a wedding and not a christening. Oh, and they'd invited me, of course. But I had work to do. Hey, I'd sent a thoughtful gift, even if I totally upstaged their stupid nerd chic wedding. Should have had a nerdier wedding if they didn't want to get upstaged. Well then, thank you very much. It's been a pleasure to read to you. Sorry about those gaffes in there. If you want a better version of this, there's an audiobook that Amber Benson, Tara from Buffy, is also a great novelist and a director and writer, and just all-around wonderful human being, has read, that you can buy everywhere except Audible. Audible won't carry my stuff because it doesn't have DRM on it. But Libro.fm or Downpour or Google Play or even my own store, craphound.com. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed the con, and I hope you enjoyed the reading, and I hope you'll pick up the book. It was nice reading to you. See you soon, I hope.